All right, good evening, folks. We are going to get started. So today, the other day we talked, as we are continuing our discussion of mouse, we talked about surviving and what it means to survive. And what I have for you today is a presentation on, let me wrestle with this. Anything up there? Yes, not nearly as much. What I have for you today is some information on basic trauma theory. And when we talk about trauma, I mean this, we talked a little bit about trauma when we were talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And so we're going to sort of codify some things that I think apply directly, not only to this text, but about trauma in general. And there are a lot of different theories pertaining to trauma. So sort of choosing from a small sampling of theories for us to understand what this is about. Trauma, defined by several different scholars. Psychic trauma occurs when a sudden, unexpected, overwhelming, intense emotional blow or a series of blows assaults the person from outside. Traumatic events are external, but they quickly become incorporated into the mind. One of the first definitions here by this scholar has to do with the unexpected, that you are going about your life in a certain way and something comes up, as we might say, from out of nowhere. Another scholar defines this as the complicated nature of trauma, as traumatization occurs when both internal and external resources are inadequate to cope with external threat. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. A traumatic experience for one person may not be a traumatic experience for another person. And then there may be traumatic experiences that sort of cut across the board that everybody would experience in the same way. And then finally, disasters have the effect of destroying the process of construction of meaning, creating a situation of shock and unexpectedness. Again, we have that sort of quality of things coming up that we had not previously planned upon. What kind of situations could we experience as traumatic? I think many of these things on this list would make sense to us. Chop, chop. Violence, war, slavery, accidents. And some of you may have had the unfortunate experience of being in some sort of accident. That could have been a traumatic experience, might have taken some time to sort of understand that experience and work through it. Domestic abuse. More recently, scholars have looked at the immigrant experience, or more specifically, the illegal immigrant experience, as being one of a traumatic, of being involved in the traumatic experience. That oftentimes either immigrants, illegal or otherwise, have that fear, that anxiety that somebody is going to knock on their door. Or if they get pulled over because they don't have license plate tabs or something like that. That has worked its way recently into the scholarship. Some scholars have looked at you folks or the high school experience. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about high school. I have my own strong thoughts about that, as I'm sure many of you do. But the high school experience, some of you may have characterized that as traumatic. Getting up early in the morning, spending 7, 8, 9 hours at school, or if you have sports, 10, 11 hours. Coming home, doing homework, participating in a sport, community service over and over again. You have a weekend, and your weekend spent doing homework or doing something pertaining to school. Scholars have looked at school as a traumatic experience. And one scholar has classified trauma in this way: the trauma of the everyday. And maybe some of you might say, oh, that's a good way to sort of describe my everyday existence in some ways. What is the trauma of the everyday? It's the responsibilities that we have to get up in the morning, to get someplace on time, to always feel anxious because you're going to be late. I felt a little anxious getting here. I made the mistake of turning on to Pontiac Trail. I never go that way on Pontiac Trail. I was stuck in traffic. I didn't know if I was going to get here. I got a little anxious. I wanted to make sure that I got here on time. I need a few minutes before class, right? Something breaks. You got to call Dell tech support. Your XM radio isn't working. Now you're on support with Sirius Radio for an hour and nothing gets fixed. Your tabs have expired. On and on and on. Those are things that some scholars have looked at that have characterized, for some, as trauma of the everyday. In these images that I have to accompany this slide, this is an image, unfortunately, all too common that we see when we turn on the news. This particular image is war-torn Syria, although this could have easily been an image just from over the weekend of the bombings in Sri Lanka. We have an image here on the lower left-hand side of slaves, and here we have an image of a protest pertaining to immigration. Two kinds of trauma that some scholars have classified. Primary trauma, the person or people that experience the event. So if you are the person that is involved in the trauma, slide here of course, the Holocaust. If you were involved in the Holocaust, you would be involved in this category, the primary trauma. If you were a witness to the event, I mean, maybe some of you have experienced this if you've seen a car accident. And I have seen a car accident before happen in front of me, and it's not a pleasant experience. I wouldn't say it changed my life or anything like that, but it was not a pleasant experience to watch. I felt very helpless when I saw a car flip over the side of a road. This is primary trauma. Secondary trauma might be, and the slide, the image on the bottom here, is of a Holocaust survivor telling an audience about his story of survival, much like Vladik tells his story to Art. They would be involved in a secondary trauma. Does this apply to everybody? Does everybody sort of process a traumatic experience that is being told to them as trauma? No, not all the time, certainly not, but sometimes. There is a relationship between the event and the mind experiencing the event. There is a loss of trust with the outside world. We have a certain set of expectations. And if we think about what we've read and discussed thus far in Maus, one of the things that I think is pretty apparent is they could die at any time. And this is not just for people, bless you, this is not just for people involved in the Holocaust. First of all, this could be for any genocide at any period of time. Whether we're talking about in Kosovo and Bosnia, or the Armenian genocide in 1915, or slavery all around the world, or 19th and 18th century America. We have a certain kind of trust that we establish, an expectation of routine, that we're going to get up in the morning, and this is what's going to go on, this is what we're going to do, this is what's going to happen. And when something comes out of left field, something traumatic, that disrupts our understanding on how the world works. This produces the traumatic experience. Trust is the building block of socialization and one's understanding of oneself and the world. This could be experienced as you as an individual, you as a part of your family, part of community, nation, or even at the world level. And here's an image. Can somebody tell me where you think this is from?
World Trade Center.
Pardon me?
World Trade Center.
World Trade Center, yeah. And I remember this very, very vividly. I mean, it was incredible. I mean, you hear people describe things like, it's surreal. And oftentimes we use language like that when people are describing trauma because it's not something that we see every day. It's surreal, or it's like a movie. You know, a couple of planes, driving into a couple of towers in New York. I think I've seen that movie. This wasn't the movie. And this was a period in time, really, there's only one other period of time that I can think about, an event like this, and that was, I think I was in 3rd grade, my pet dinosaur and I, when the shuttle Challenger blew up. And like the whole nation, the whole country was sort of mourning together. And this was another moment like that. And I will say this, I mean, the president at the time was George Bush. And I was not policy-wise, a big George Bush fan. But I'll tell you, he did something I thought was pretty darn good. And he was able to keep this country together during this very trying and traumatic time because there was a quick to blame Muslims in the United States. And we see some of that going on today, but not just Muslims, all sorts of people of difference in this country, unfortunately, right now. But during this period of time, this president, again, whom I did not really abide or believe in many of his policies, he said, you know what, we're all Americans, and I thought he did a pretty good job with that. But this was a traumatic experience that I think was experienced as community, nation, and perhaps even world. Extreme trauma. Now, those images are a little bit here of comic relief, I suppose, but extreme trauma, trauma that everybody might experience together or the same way. Conditional trauma, something that is acute. It happens one time, and you work through various processes to get through that. It could be acute. It could be chronic. The length of the trauma, a single event, or this is a chronic condition. People internalize experience differently based on temperament, personality, genes, and even training. And the images that I have here are a little bit of comic relief. I have a woman at the top who is covered by, I think, anacondas. And for many people, that would be a little bit scary. I will tell you, I would not want to be covered by anacondas. But apparently this woman is not too traumatized by it. She doesn't look all that happy. But in this particular case, she's not, perhaps not traumatized. And the woman in the lower left-hand corner, who has, I think, again, an anaconda, finds this to be a very traumatic experience. This became a serious area of inquiry during and after World War I. So we've talked a little bit, we talked about World War I when we had our discussion about modernism. The technology that was involved in World War I, tanks, machine guns, submarines, ordnances dropped by airplanes, phosphine gas, chlorine gas, mustard gas. After World War I, or I should say during World War I and after, scholars looked at the reactions of soldiers. Why was it that a soldier was not functioning well, even if they did not have any injuries, any visible injuries to their body? Well, this was a period in history that mankind, that humankind, had not seen this level of destruction in human history before. And people from all over the world, they had a very difficult time understanding what this meant. We come up with a few terms. There's actually a whole host of terms that were developed during World War I. And actually during many wartime situations, there seemed to be new vocabulary that is developed to help describe the situation. And I think we talked about during our discussion of modernism, the basket case. Does anybody remember what that was? If you were a basket case, that meant that your body parts were strewn over the battlefield and somebody had to get a basket and collect them. And there's about a dozen or a dozen and a half various terms that were developed during this period of time, many of which would be unfamiliar to us, but basket case is really the most popular. Things like shell shock, right? A term that we had once used, now it's called post-traumatic stress syndrome. Some soldiers were executed for cowardice. Psychologists came up with this idea of shell shock as something real. It's about recognition versus rejection. Freud believed that we skipped the traumatic experience, that oftentimes we didn't remember what happened at a particular point in time, but the experience did not go away. It's still inside. And oftentimes when you speak to people that have had, let's say, a basic traumatic experience, let's talk about maybe like a car accident. Do you remember what happened? I don't. I don't remember what happened. I remember right? I mean, does this sound familiar when, listening to somebody tell a story about an accident, or if you were the unfortunate person who has experienced an accident, that you're telling the story, yeah, I remember driving, and then I woke up and I was in an ambulance, or I was on the side of the road, or something like that. Does that sound familiar to us? Yeah. So beginning with Freud and other psychologists, they believed that the mind had a duty to protect you essentially from the experience. And so it cut out, it edited, it made you forget. So you do not remember the traumatic experience itself. However, it doesn't mean the traumatic experience is gone from your memory. It's still in there. And then this becomes a kind of arm wrestling, a kind of battle between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. The conscious mind, which needs to be protected, the unconscious mind is trying to protect your consciousness from the traumatic experience, while at the same time, there is a desire to remember that which you forgot. Oftentimes when we talk about trauma, we forget the things we want to remember, and we forget the things, oftentimes in trauma, we forget the things we want to remember, and we remember the things that we want to forget. That sounds about right. Yeah. That's an anti-metaboly, by the way, if you're keeping track. So that's one of the sort of possibilities of explaining this. That this protects the mind, that it becomes absent in memory, but it demands to be known. So there are sort of signs. There is this desire for the mind to protect, but also to tell. But it just can't let you remember things. It gives you little bits and pieces of it. How does it do that? Well, it might do it through dreams. You might dream about something. Now, according to a classical theorist like Freud, when you dream about something, whatever you think you're dreaming about, the manifest content, it's not what you're really dreaming about. It's the latent content. It's the stuff that you talk to a professional about. What is the strangest part of that dream? Well, there's a person there, but I didn't know who that person was. Well, what's the strangest part? Well, there was this object in the corner. It was a rabbit, and it was just very, very strange. Everything is about symbolism. Everything is about being condensed and displaced. Now, Jung believed in universal archetypes, and we dreamt often about universal archetypes. But as one theorist called Jung's understanding of the dream works as transliminal, that sometimes an object in a dream may just be that object, and it doesn't have to be symbolic. So if you were dreaming about an experience, or dreaming about, let's say, somebody that had passed away, according to Freud, everything is symbolic. Jung says, maybe you are dreaming about that person. So subsequent manifestations that are explored and expressed from the conscious and the unconscious. Repetition, obsessive-compulsive behavior. So if your mind is being protected, again, at the same time, the memory demands to be heard in some ways. These are manifested by a variety of different, I guess we'd call them symptoms. So repetition, obsessive-compulsive behavior, dreams, flashbacks, parataxis, which are slips of the tongue. Physical symptoms. You may experience, or a person may experience something symptomatic physically. And you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, I don't know what's wrong. My arm is not working correctly. Or I have terrible migraines. Or I have a terrible, chronic upset stomach. All of those things are possibilities. Anxiety, anger. Now, when we talk about anxiety, all of us experience anxiety sometimes. You're not used to standing up in front of this class and you have a presentation. Or I call on you and you hadn't read the material. You get a little anxious. You don't want to stand up here. You don't want to give a presentation. You're going to a job interview. It's a big deal. You're going to be able to tell them that you're a student at Lawrence Tech and you want them to start you at $25 an hour. You get a little bit anxious about that, right? This kind of anxiety is an anxiety that you can't explain. This is a kind of anxiety that when you're having a fine day, A lovely day. I got here a little bit early. Traffic, it was a little bit tough, but I made it here on time. I got to sit outside and look around as everybody walked by me on their phone, not even noticing that it was a pretty nice day outside. That's another story, right? So I'm sitting outside, and let's say a person suffering from anxiety is sitting outside and having a fine time. And then they get that feeling, maybe a little bit of cold sweat, heartbeat, all of those things that I think most of us are familiar with, but there's no discernible reason. That's a sign, perhaps, of something else. That is the desire of that memory to be expressed, to make itself be known. And so there's nothing particularly going on. It's just that that particular moment in time, that desire, that unconscious desire for expression, is knocking on the door. That's the kind of anxiety that I'm talking about. And that's the kind of anxiety, unfortunately, that many people today in our modern world suffer from because we have so much going on. And this goes back to perhaps the trauma of the everyday. Okay? So anxiety, anger, depression, shame, guilt, all of these things, I think, are relevant to understanding Vladek and Art Spiegelman and Maus. Depression. And I think what's important, too, is, you know, we live in a post-Freudian society. Whether you like Freud or Klein or Jung, these are words that you have probably used before, maybe correctly, maybe incorrectly. The unconscious, sublimation, projection, right? All of those sorts of things. Just today, barely, are we paying attention to people in our country with mental illness. And sort of one of the problems with mental illness when it comes to any of these sorts of symptoms or mental illness in general or understanding trauma is that you don't have a cast on your arm. You don't have a crutch. You don't have a bandage over the eye. That for the most part, you may look like everybody else. In the 1990s, unfortunately, Michigan got rid of, I think the governor at the time was Angler, he got rid of a handful, or maybe handfuls, of mental hospitals in the state. The Northville Psychiatric Facility was just, I think, torn down about 2 years ago. And my wife, who is a therapist, she went to that hospital as part of an internship way back when she was doing her training. There was a mental facility in Pontiac, right near the old mall. I can't remember what the mall was. In Summit Place, yeah. And on the east side, northeast side from that mall, there was a mental facility there. It looked like Arkham Asylum. It was absolutely Arkham Asylum, Batman, right? When we can work Batman into a lecture, that's a good thing, right? It was torn down, and I think there are houses now. And so, in our society, we have devalued mental illness historically, and just more recently, we're bringing more attention to it. Does this relate to trauma? I think that it does, particularly with trauma that is unreconciled. The incapacity to feel pleasure, sexual perversion or abnormality, wordless silence, or psychotic or personality breaks. And this was studied by scholars. Studied by scholars, and I think we talked about this in our discussion of modernism, after World War I, describe that experience. And this part, I think, is a postmodern concept about the limits of language. That maybe the best tool that we have in our toolbox is language. The more words that we learn, the better we are able to express ourselves. But there is a limit to what we can express. And oftentimes, when we are talking about the traumatic experience from perhaps a violent moment like the Holocaust, you cannot discuss it. It's, you know what, I'm going to tell you, I can't do it. I don't have the words for it. And scholars looked at soldiers, and they used to stand, they'd get up at dawn, and they'd stare out at the sunrise. And scholars wondered, why did you do this? Why did you do this? And they said, you know what, we didn't have anything else to do. We couldn't talk about our experience, so we just stared at the sunrise. Okay? Wordless silence, you could have psychotic or personality breaks, identity changes. Did slavery in the 19th and 18th century in America, did it change identities? Absolutely. Not just in a physical or physiological way, but in a psychological way. Did it change the trajectory of Vladek's life, being put in Auschwitz? Did he become a different person? I would think so. I would think so. It changed his identity. And of course, suicide. And it is unfortunate that in our society, the rates of suicide are tending to increase rather than decrease, even though we are becoming a little bit more conscientious of the role of mental illness. And from my own experience, my boys go to West Bloomfield High School. I think 5 out of the last 6 years, somebody at that high school has killed themselves. So when we talk about the sort of limits of language, I think that comes into play, that we don't have the words. We also don't have the time or the caring often associated with situations like this, because everyone's busy. Even people that are there to help are overworked and busy. So this relates to this experience. What Art Spiegelman is doing, perhaps for his father, or what he did for his father, is perhaps what no other psychologist could have done for him. That bond between father and son. Perhaps Vladek felt a little bit more able to tell his story. But we also talked about that process of storytelling. Whose story is this? Is this Vladek's story? In part, is this Art Spiegelman's story? This is the story that Art Spiegelman is telling about his father. And we see that sort of narrative struggle between the two. When Vladek says, don't talk about that, talk about this, and we know about it because we talked about that, because Art Spiegelman put that in the story he was telling. So in general, when we talk about trauma, what to do? Trauma is a complex relationship between the etiology, the initial event, and its re-memory. So we remember, we reconcile, and hopefully come to a level of acceptance. And that is why, and I think there's, yes, there is an image from the students at Parkland who survived that massacre. They wrote a book. And that's what people do. And when something happens at a school, that's where you say, counselors are there to talk to people. Oftentimes, it's too soon. It's too soon. Do we think Vladek Spiegelman would have wanted to tell his story when he was set free from Auschwitz? Probably not. It takes a long time. And unfortunately, in our society, there's other news that go on. News cycles change. So it's a year, it's 2 years, it's 5 years. Just recently, just in the last couple of months, 2 survivors of the Parkland high school massacre killed themselves within about 2 weeks of one another. Oftentimes you find soldiers that return from combat or survivors in war-torn countries that survive, like Anya. She survived the Holocaust. So you think, oh, she survived the Holocaust, she could survive anything. Well, she couldn't. She couldn't survive remembering about the traumatic experience. And we talk about the Holocaust because that's what what Mouse is about. We could be talking about Syria. We could be talking about survivors in Afghanistan. We could be talking about the survivors in Sri Lanka. We could be talking about really a lot of different places in the country, or I should say around the world today. So when you go to a counselor or a therapist and you do have insurance and they're going to pay for 10 sessions, which isn't enough time, really depending on your experience. Or you go to a psychoanalyst and the psychoanalyst says, yeah, of course I can help you. It's going to take a little bit of time. I need you here 5 days a week and I think in about 15 years, we'll be able to make some progress. Right? There's different kinds of psychologists. And really, that's dictated by economics, by what insurance will and will not pay for. But what do you do when you go to a therapist or a counselor? You talk about things. You remember things. You play games, mind games, if you will. You know, you think you're withholding, but you tell this, and you eventually get around to that which you are withholding. But you talk about it, you come to a certain level of reconciliation, maybe a certain level of acceptance. So you talk about the event, therapy, different kinds. You write about it. Journals, books, newspaper articles. That is also a way to reconcile with the traumatic experience. And you get family and community support. Is that enough? Depends on the individual, depends on the experience. Depends if this is something that you experienced by yourself, or in the case of Vladek and the Jewish people during World War II, as a community. Ultimately, it's something that you have to heal on your own. Okay. So I wanted to sort of present to you a variety of different aspects of trauma theory. And I think that this is not trauma theory as it relates to this particular book. This is trauma, you know, sort of a conglomeration of various trauma theories, is how it relates to us every day, and then how we can relate it to various literary texts like Maus. Any questions or comments on that? No? Okay. All right, let me turn this off, and if you want to take out, we're still working out of Maus 1, we will continue our discussion.